Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, Israel gets set to approve thousands of new settlement homes in Judea and Samaria. The nation levies its first ever criminal indictments against a coronavirus quarantine breaker, and the IDF offers some unique tips for enjoying the holidays under lockdowns. Now we begin with reports of rocket fire overnight. The IDF informing of a single missile launched from Gaza into Israeli territory around 10 p.m. Monday evening. Sirens sounding near Kibbutz Kerem Shalom. This is the first rocket launch from Gaza since mid-September, when 13 were fired at Israel during the White House signing ceremony for the Abraham Accords between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain. And as per policy, while no damages or injuries were reported last night, the IDF has attacked Hamas targets in the Gaza Strip in the wake of the launch. The IDF Twitter posting that we will protect Israeli civilians from terror. Meanwhile, in Judea and Samaria, 3 Palestinian suspects attacked IDF soldiers at a military post near the city of Tulkarem with Molotov cocktails, and the soldiers opened fire in response, hitting one. They're now conducting searches for the other 2 assailants. Now, in other news, as part of the newly signed Abraham Accords between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Israel has agreed to temporarily freeze plans for annexations in Judea and Samaria. That isn't stopping the Israeli government from expanding settlement construction. Nittany Manson reports.
Upwards of 4,400 new Israeli homes slated for construction in the West Bank are now set to be approved by next week. This following roughly 8 months of silence from the Defense Ministry's Civil Administration's High Planning Subcommittee, the government body responsible for enabling such construction. But even more surprising is who's behind the recent expansion. Reports pointing not to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but to his rival, Defense Minister Benny Gantz. Gantz is allegedly promoting the plans in efforts to court settlement heads, who are angry at Netanyahu for freezing annexation as part of the Abraham peace accords with the UAE. Then, adding insult to injury for the Palestinians, most of the construction is set to occur in so-called isolated settlements, which are not part of the larger settlement blocks Israel would likely absorb in a future peace deal. So many Palestinians are now turning to the Arab world, specifically to those on speaking terms with Israel, to pressure Jerusalem to abandon these plans. After all, if the UAE could freeze annexations, they could freeze settlements too, right?
How can we move these initiatives that we saw negative, or agreements that we saw negative, to serve our purpose? Certainly they could serve our purpose. How can we talk to our Arab friends, family, and say, hey, why don't you pressure Israel that you're talking to stop the settlements, to freeze the settlements?
But it turns out it may not be that easy, as Palestinian leadership seems to have burnt its bridges with the Gulf. Former Saudi Arabian intelligence chief and former ambassador to the U.S., Prince Bandar bin Sultan, slamming the PA leadership for criticizing the Arab world over normalizing with Israel. Bin Sultan telling Saudi media on Monday that the Palestinians' criticism is a reprehensible transgression, unbecoming from officials seeking to gain support for their cause, adding that the Palestinian leadership has been taking advantage of Saudi aid for 70 years. Similarly, in a 2017 interview, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman also stated that if the PA truly wanted to stop the settlements, they'd have come to an agreement with Israel years ago. And this indicating the growing disillusion with the Palestinians all across the Arab world.
So did the Arab world truly turn its back on the Palestinians and forget about their cause? Joining me to discuss is former advisor to President Shimon Peres, former deputy ambassador to Egypt, and CEO of the Ruth boutique strategic consultancy firm, Middle East expert Ruth Wasserman-Landa. Ruth, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It's a pleasure.
My pleasure. All right, so did the Arab world abandon the Palestinians?
Look, I think that there is a sense of being a little bit fed up with the Palestinian leadership, making the wrong decisions over and over again, holding the Palestinian people hostage because of issues pertaining to honor and so on. God forbid I'm not belittling their national objectives. And yet there is kind of a fatigue on certain parts of the Arab world. And this was very, very clear in the recent Arab League decision. It was very much played out in the complete and utter rejection of the Palestinian request to put down the Abraham Accord and simply reject it. In turn, the Palestinians themselves were rejected, and I would say that was a little bit of a blow to their honor, and a kind of a mirror image of what it is that is happening in the Arab world in general at the moment.
Well, so do you think that the lessons that maybe the Gulf states are trying to impart on the Palestinian Authority are starting to sink in?
No, not yet. I think that there is a kind of a blossoming realization that not at every cost will the Arab world in its entirety stand behind the demands, the wishes, and the leg dragging of the Palestinian leadership. I think there is a burgeoning of a realization, and I'm not sure it's ripe yet. I believe it will be made ripe once messages are being transmitted, because it's not like the Arab world, despite everything that I've said. It's not that the Palestinians are put aside by the Arab world completely. There is, first of all, a need for them not to fall into the hands of Erdogan, of the Hamas, and that's what Erdogan is trying to do, to actually push the Fatah leadership into the arms of Hamas, into the hands of Iran, into the hands of other not like-minded partners in the region. So there is a vested interest amidst all the players on the other side of the camp, Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, the Gulf states, Jordan, Egypt, and so on, to keep the Palestinians from falling into the hands of these extreme players in the region. That's one.
And what's their chance of success with that?
I believe that this is part of the plan. I believe that this is part of the plan. I will repeat that the third time. I believe that this is part of the plan. Whether with this particular leadership or with another leadership, this is part of the plan. It's not that they have turned their backs to the Palestinian people, and it's not like they do not understand the need for stability. The West Bank is here. I live near Hadera. 2 minutes from me, literally, is the West Bank. It is important to understand and to comprehend the difference between that and the Gaza Strip.
Sure.
The West Bank is so close, so part and parcel of the geostrategic makeup of Israel. It needs to be taken into account. It's a must. It's not even a question. It's realpolitik. So if the current leadership is willing to come on board, welcome. They're not playing out in that particular way right now. But if they are not, then there is a strategy to move along with a different leadership, be it what may. And I'm not sure that that is being left completely to luck, but to move the region to stability and away from Erdogan, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran.
All right. Ruth, thank you so much for being with us today. All right, moving on. Tentative good news on the coronavirus front continuing as the infection rate in Israel holds firm at around 11.7%, down from over 13% last week. But Prime Minister Netanyahu says it's still too early to end closures. Another steep rise in the number of new coronavirus cases in Israel. The health ministry announcing at least 5,647 new infections overnight Tuesday. The infection rate is holding, though, indicating that the higher case number comes from an increase in the number of tests performed, aka the lockdown seems to be working. But just moments ahead of Monday night's coronavirus cabinet meeting, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was pleading with the Israeli public to stay strong and abide by the guidelines.
עדכון יומי קצר, מצב התחלואה מראה סימנים ראשונים של בלימה, מוקדם מדי להגיד אם זה יחזיק מעמד. כל המומחים אומרים לנו, גם בקבינט הקורונה, חכו עוד שבוע לפחות, שנדע אם יש באמת ירידה לפני שנחליט על צעדי ההמשך. דבר שני, אני אומר לכם, חרדים, חילונים, בתפילות, בהלוויות, בהפגנות, כולם חייבים לכבד את הכללים. אין לנו שום פריבילגיה לסטות מזה. לא למוכר הפלאפל, לא לחבר או חברת הכנסת ולא לשר או שרה בממשלה. כולנו מחויבים לכללים. אני מבקש מכם לעשות את זה. אם נעשה את זה יחד, נשמור אחד על השני, נשמור על המדינה שלנו. חג שמח.
So to that end, the coronavirus cabinet has agreed to extend lockdown restrictions until October 14, and Netanyahu adding that the rules are unlikely to be lifted before October 18, especially as many continue to openly violate the regulations. Several government ministers and Knesset members who've broken the rules aside, Netanyahu specifically addressing the ultra-Orthodox sector, which continues to fight authorities en masse as they try to enforce the holiday restrictions. Particularly on Monday, when thousands of Haredim traveled to Ashdod for the funeral of a well-known rabbi, who himself ironically succumbed to coronavirus complications earlier this week. Now, new infections this morning bring the total to well over 274,400, nearly 64,000 actively sick, 895 of whom are in serious condition, and the death toll likewise rising to 1,771. Now, as for those who've been caught breaking coronavirus lockdown regulations, time to watch out. In a landmark first, Israel has just indicted a 24-year-old man for knowingly violating quarantine and infecting others with the pathogen. The defendant, Yochai Haddad, having left his government-mandated home isolation to attend a party, and just a week after being told that he had contracted the virus. Meanwhile, Attorney General Mandelblit is now set to rule on whether or not to open a similar criminal investigation. Israeli police on Tuesday providing Mandelblit with the results of an initial probe into Environmental Protection Minister Gila Gamliel. Gamliel allegedly violated the lockdown orders over Yom Kippur to travel from Tel Aviv to her family in Tiberias, 150 kilometers away. And while there, she attended a synagogue service, after which both Gamliel and nearly 24 others were confirmed as COVID-19 carriers. But more importantly to the case, Gamliel initially lied to contact tracing investigators about her activities and how she got infected. Many are now calling on her to resign or to be fired. Joining us now with more is columnist for Newsweek and editor of HistoryCentral.com, Mark Schulman. Mark, thank you so much for being with us. Now, should Minister Gamliel be indicted or just fined?
She should resign. If this was a different era, she should be tarred and feathered as far as I'm concerned. You really can't have a situation where no one takes responsibility. The whole question, they say in any sort of pandemic, is responsible leadership people can believe in. You can't have a situation where someone is in the government and then just totally ignores the rules and heads off to wherever she headed off to, Tiberias. Look, the reality is no one takes personal responsibility in our government. This has been going on for a long time. The last person to take personal responsibility was probably Menachem Begin when he resigned over what took place in the Lebanon War. No one, doesn't make a difference what mistakes you make, you don't resign. Look, as far as I'm concerned, Education Minister Gallant should have resigned without a question at this point. He was the one who pushed to open schools. He said there's nothing to fear. Well, there's nothing to fear, and our numbers doubled and tripled again. So no one takes any responsibility. She's the latest, but she's the most clearest. I mean, she violated all the terms that we talk about. And she traveled, she went to synagogue, and on top of everything else, she got sick. I mean, the reality is she should lose her position as member of the government. In almost every other government in the world, she would have resigned. In our government, people don't resign. And frankly, I don't care whether she gets prosecuted or not. She shouldn't be in the government.
So why do you believe? Because Netanyahu has so far fallen short of overtly criticizing her or calling for her ousting. Why do you think that is?
Well, let's see. A prime minister who's been indicted for 3 different cases. How can he sort of talk about moral responsibility? That's a real problem here. People talk about how can you have a prime minister who's under indictment? Well, you can talk about a lot of things. Does he have time? Does he have the energy? But it comes down to this. It's hard to have moral leadership when you're in this situation. I don't believe there's any other democracy in the world where such a situation exists.
Well, so I understand where you're coming from, but unlike other cases, for example, Yochai Haddad, who is, as far as we can tell, the first Israeli to be indicted criminally for breaking the restrictions and spreading the virus. Gamliel has apologized. She said that she would pay the fine for breaking travel restrictions. She said that she didn't know she had coronavirus at the time of her travel. So is it really fair to go to the same extent?
Excuse me. She said, I made a mistake in judgment. I made a mistake in judgment is walking more than 1,000 meters from your house. maybe going to visit your grandson for 2 seconds to bring him a package. It's not getting in a car, traveling for an hour and a half to quote-unquote your alternate house, going to synagogue with more than 10 people indoors, and then traveling back to Tel Aviv. I mean, the whole country was on lockdown. The whole point of the lockdown was not to do this. This isn't a judgment that a mistaken judgment. This was a sense that I'm above it. I don't have to follow the rules. Well, you know what? The whole country doesn't want to follow the rules. That's why we have the rebellion against these rules this time. That's why if you look on the roads today, the difference between the first lockdown and the second lockdown in Tel Aviv is dramatic. I've gone to some of the main buildings outside, the high-tech buildings, and about 50% of the workforce is there. I interviewed one of the people in one of the buildings the other day, and I said, well, why are you here? He said, well, I work for a company that's involved in infrastructure and work. I said, but why are you in the office? Well, it's a younger person. Well, it's more fun to be in the office than to work from home. I said, what about the pandemic? Well, we don't have to worry about the pandemic. I'll be okay. And with that attitude, that's why it's very difficult to get rid of the pandemic. And we need to make it very clear this is very, very serious. And the same with the ultra-Orthodox community. I mean, the news today that the police have a hidden agreement with the ultra-Orthodox in Jerusalem that as long as they don't publicize their mass events, the police aren't going to intervene. Really? I mean, we need to have a policy that says zero tolerance, whether you're a cabinet minister, an ultra-Orthodox Jew, or a secular person who's going to the beach.
All right, Mark Shulman, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
In other news, with approximately 1 million Israelis and rising unemployed now due to the COVID-19 pandemic, concerns are swirling on how the economy will get back on its feet. But the government is hoping to solve this problem with an all-new initiative. The new program, developed by the Israel Innovation Authority in collaboration with the Ministries of Finance and Economy and Industry, will offer assistance to experienced employees now jobless due to the pandemic by training them in research and development and helping them find a job. Though it's still unknown if the program will be successful in placing participants into real jobs, or even if training a sizable number of people will be possible to do in time. But still, hope is high that this pilot project will work and inspire others to join the initiative. Well, here now to answer our questions about the new government job training pilot, we have Vice President of the Innovation Authority and the head of its startup division, Anya Eldan. Anya, thanks so much for being with us.
Good to be here.
All right, so Anya, you're closely involved with this program. What is it exactly?
Well, it's a program that is supposed to help hire a lot of people. The program is an emergency response to the situation with an unemployment. We have hundreds of people looking for jobs. Out of them, hundreds with advanced degrees and with the ability to learn and to be trained in technical and digital professions. And this is what we're doing, encouraging such training so that employees can hire those people as soon as possible.
So can you tell me a little bit more about some of the details. How many people are going to be involved? How many people are eligible for this program?
Okay. The first of all, we're not providing a program for unemployment people. We're providing a program for companies who want to train and hire people in digital and technological positions. So we're publishing a tender this week, and people who can apply can be either high-tech companies or industry companies who wish to train and hire technical professions, or companies whose business is to train and to place such employees.
Wow, and so what kind of companies have you been speaking to or maybe are interested in taking part in this program?
So first of all, the difference in this program is that we provide incentive not just for hardcore algorithm programmers and engineers. In this case, we've expanded the scope. We provide funding also for training digital professions, IT professions, network managers, even digital salespeople. So a whole bunch of different professions. We think that the new situation has expedited the digital transformation very quickly in a lot of different segments. And we hope there is a need by the high-tech company, but also by other industry segments, to train and hire those people who can provide those professions.
Wow. All
and
right.
as soon as possible.
All right. Now I understand that you said earlier you've made it clear that this is not exactly a program for unemployment for the sake of solving the unemployment, especially now with nearly 1 million unemployed here in Israel. But that being said, how many positions do you expect to open up through this program?
Well, actually, this program is targeting the job seekers, especially as a result of this situation. It targets people who can and wish and are capable of learning technical professions and being hired. So the pilot is 60 million shekels. We expected to allow training about 3,000 people, which is a small part to start, but if it's successful, this program can grow very quickly.
Wow.
So it really depends on the number of companies approaching us and creating interest.
All right. Well, I wish you and this program nothing but success. Thank you so much for being with us, Anya.
Thank you.
Moving on, the week-long holiday of Sukkot is nearing its end, but it's never too late to celebrate, and Israeli President Reuven Rivlin is helping out. Now, typically, the office of the president has hosted thousands of Israeli families in Jerusalem for Sukkot, where they met, danced, hugged, shook hands, and posed together in celebration. So this year, Rivlin has taken the initiative to invite the country to join him again. Just this time, it's, of course, in the form of an online and live event, which started this morning at 10 a.m. in Jerusalem. So if you're interested in a socially distanced party that's sure to be fun for the whole family, head on over to the president's Facebook page and see it for yourself. Happy holidays. And finally, at the start of Israel's coronavirus lockdown, IDF soldiers all over the country packed their bags and headed off to base for an indefinite amount of time. And while this may not seem like a big deal to American soldiers, in Israel, personnel are used to getting leave for the holidays. After all, most soldiers are stationed just a few hours away from their homes at most. So for all those without a clue, some IDF soldiers have now released a guide on how to celebrate this year's Sukkot on base.
אהלן, מה קורה? עכשיו חג הסוכות, וכפי שאתם יודעים, בחג הסוכות נהוג לישון תחת כיפת השמיים. אני לוחם פה, ישן כבר מעל 50 יום. בואו ניתן לכם כמה טיפים איך להסתדר בשטח יותר טוב. דבר ראשון שאני ממליץ, זה שתמיד יהיה לנו איזה אור כזה, שאנחנו לא נצטרך להחזיק אותו עם הידיים, ושיהיה לנו פה תאורה ונוכל להתעסק עם כל הדברים שלנו להכנות ללילה. בנוסף, אני ממש אוהב לפתוח את הבוקר עם איזה קפה כזה, עם כל החבר'ה, קפה שחור, מסתפקים במה שיש בשטח, אבל מפנקים גם בעוגיה, שככה יהיה לטעם טוב יותר. בנוסף, אסור לשכוח גם קרם הגנה, ברגע שאתה יוצא מהצל, קצת חם פה. וייסמן, אל תשכח את המוזיקה שלנו. כמובן, טוב. אפשר בלי מוזיקה ככה, להניע את האווירה קצת עם החבר'ה. בנוסף, אני גם לא שוכח מהכובע. חשוב שלא נתייבש. וזהו, זה הטיפים שלי, להעביר את הזמן בשטח ולישון יותר טוב. שיהיה לכולם חג סוכות שמח.
All right, let's take a look now at the weather forecast. It looks like clear skies tonight and pleasant temperatures with a low of 67 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees Celsius. Then tomorrow calls for bright and sunny with average highs rising to around 93 Fahrenheit or 34 degrees Celsius. And now, of course, before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel.
We're celebrating Sukkot from the highest sukkah in the IDF.
All right, and here we have the IDF building a sukkah for the holiday on top of the central command in the middle of Tel Aviv. The building is called the Kiryah. And this is just, what a great view, a great place to put the sukkah. Wow. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.41 shekels to the American dollar and 2.57 to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and Roku TV pages. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.